provider, specifically auth0. auth0 is a security-as-a-service paid cloud provider for identity. Conceptually, auth0 is very similar to Identity Server in terms of what it can do. But instead of setting up a site and customizing your code to get your STS set up, you instead configure a tenant account with auth0 with client configurations and API resources that you need to secure using auth0 as your STS. So I'll start by discussing how you want to integrate with auth0. Then I'll show you how to set up your client application, API resource, and users in auth0. Next, I'll cover what needs to change in our Angular app client configuration to use auth0 as our identity provider instead of Identity Server. So at the end of this module, you should have a good sense of how the standardization of the OpenID Connect and auth2 protocols can be implemented by different providers, and yet connecting them from your Angular SPA is very similar. OpenID Connect is a standard protocol, which means you should be able to easily switch to another OIDC provider with minimal changes. Let me show you that is mostly true by switching our app to use auth0 as its STS. Even though it is a standard, there are some configuration differences from provider to provider. But for most, it is small configuration changes. The major identity providers usually have their own JavaScript library for simplifying integration with their service. So it is definitely an option to just use their library so that you can follow along with their documentation to get connected quickly, especially if you know you are already committed to using that one IDP for your applications. But I'll stick to using OIDC client here to connect to auth0 to emphasize the standardization. Even though they have their own library that I could use, I think it adds insight into the protocol details that will benefit you in the long run by showing how to connect using OIDC client. And it will help you get an understanding of what things are the same and what things are slightly different between providers. To get started, I've created a free account at auth0, which just requires providing your email and a password. It then asks you to create a tenant, which I've already done, creating a tenant named Brian Noyes. To move to a different IDP, you'll have to get familiar with each IDP's way of configuring client apps, API resources, and users to get everything set up correctly. auth0 has a pretty nice user interface and really good documentation to help you sort that out. So I'll log in, and it takes me to their management portal dashboard. From there, I can click the Create Application button to create a client application. I'll give the client a name of Securing Angular Apps Client. For the application type, I'm going to leave native selected instead of picking single-page web applications, which may seem like the more logical choice. This is because at the time of this update to the course, auth0 did not provide a way to configure authorization code flow with Pixie through the single-page web applications type, only through the native app type. But that's okay because we can configure everything else we need as a native app. So I'll click Create, and then it takes me to the Quick Start for that application. Their Quick Start assumes you are using their client library for setting things up, so I'll just jump over to the settings for this client app to configure things myself instead. You can see that auth0 has assigned a client ID to this app that is just an opaque string. I'll need that for the config changes in our Angular app in a little while. In the settings for that app, I can scroll down and find the Allowed Callback URLs field. In there, I just provide the same URL that we have in the client, specifically http localhost 4200/signin-callback. I can then scroll down a bit more and provide the allowed logout URLs, which for us is http localhost 4200 signout-callback. And I'll also set the allowed CORS origins to HTTP localhost 4200. I can then scroll to the bottom and click on Show Advanced Settings. In there, I just need to go to Grant Types and deselect the other grant types other than authorization code. Next, I need to define an API resource for my project's API as a resource that is protected by the Auth0 authentication. So I can select APIs in the left nav menu here, and then click the Create API button at the top right. I will name that Projects API, and for the identifier, it can be any arbitrary string. Whatever you use here will become the audience parameter for the protocol flows. They recommend using a URL, but it doesn't have to be a URL, and even if it is a URL, it doesn't have to be one you can get to as an HTTP address on the web. So I'm just going to use projects-API as my identifier, and I'll leave the signing algorithm on RS-256 and click Create. Once that API has been created, I can go into the Permissions tab for that API and add a permission named Projects-API. This corresponds to the scope that will be requested by the client to access my API. Finally, I'll need to configure users that can log into this IDP tenant when redirected to Auth0 from my client app. So I select Users and Roles in the left nav bar, then Users. I click Create User, and I will quickly add Alice at globalmatics.com with the test with capital T, 123, 3 exclamation marks password, just like I've been doing with Identity Server. Next up, we just need to make some tweaks to our configuration for OIDC client in our Angular app to connect and use Auth0 as the STS instead of Identity Server. When it comes to configuring things in Identity Server, since Identity Server is a framework for building your own STS, the configuration settings for clients, APIs, and their associated settings can just be set from code, configuration, or a database. But there are no nice clean UIs to go through to set up your configuration like there is with Auth0. But then again, Identity Server is a free open source framework, and Auth0 is a paid service that can be a bit expensive depending on the size of your organization and what features you need to support. So if I try to do the minimal changes you might expect to get things working, I'll go add the Auth0 client ID to my constants file, so it's easy to switch there like the URLs. I'll comment out the value I was using for Identity Server, and add the one provided by Auth0 as my current value, which I again just copy out of their tenant portal. Then I need to change the authority URL, and that gets set to briannoyes.auth0.com, because Auth0 sets up a subdomain for each tenant. With those changes in place, I can go fire up the app, click Login, and I get redirected to Auth0's login interface. I'll log in with Alice's user account, and on first login there, it will present a consent screen that tells the user what access is being requested. In this case, granting the client application access to the tenant and the profile scope. So from there, I can click the green checkmark button, and everything seems to go smoothly, and I am redirected back into my app, and it recognizes I am logged in, as you can tell by the menu bar contents. If I go look at session storage in the Applications tab of the browser debugger, I can see an entry for my subdomain at Auth0. If you look at the access token property on that, it's just a short string compared to the ID token that's longer because it's a JOT. So it turns out Auth0 does not give you a JOT for your access token by default. But we will want the access token to be a JOT so that we can include whatever claims we need for authorization purposes at the API. Finally, if I go back to the app and try to log out, nothing happens. And if I look at the browser debugger console, you can see there is an error from the OIDC client library saying there is no end session endpoint. So let's fix those issues next. So the issues I have at this point are that I can't log out of the app, and I'm not getting a JOT for our access token. Let's attack those one at a time. It turns out auth0 requires some specific things added to the URLs used in the protocol flow to have the right thing happen. So I'll need to make some modifications to my client configuration to do what they're expecting. I can manually set the metadata for the configuration of the user manager. There are 6 endpoint URLs I need to set manually through the metadata property on the settings object that I pass into the user manager constructor. Those include the issuer, authorization, JWKS URI, token, user info, and end session endpoints. To figure out what values you need for those, you can go back to the auth0 portal, go into the settings for the client application, scroll to the bottom, click on Show Advanced Settings, and select the Endpoints tab in the Advanced Settings panel. The URLs shown there cover 4 of the 6 endpoints we need. One not explicitly called out there is the issuer. That should just be set to the root authority URL. The other is the end session endpoint, which I'll come to shortly. Instead of making you watch me copy-paste a bunch of URLs, let me just paste in the almost complete metadata block here. The missing one is the same one that was missing from the metadata, the end session endpoint. A little digging in the docs revealed that you need to use a URL with your tenant subdomain, followed by v2/logout, and then include a query string with a client ID parameter set to the client ID of the application and a return to parameter set to the signout callback URL for our client app. I wrapped the root part of that return to URL in a call to encode URI to escape the colon and slashes in the URL, since it's a query string parameter. Then I can also remove the post-logout redirect URI, since it's not being used for this IDP because we're overriding it with the end session endpoint. With those changes in place, I can save the changes and try again. Now I can click login in the app, and I am redirected to auth0 again. Then I can click logout, and this time it quickly returns to the app and is logged out. And if I check the debugger console, we can see there are no errors there. If I log back in again, I have to provide username and password again because the successful logout also kills the login session with the STS, just like with Identity Server. So I'll log in again as Alice. Now, if I look at the application tab of the debugger, you can see that my access token is still just a short opaque string. Returning an opaque string is still completely legal in the auth2 protocol, but I want to get a JOT for an access token, like I do with Identity Server. So another little dive into the auth0 docs reveals that auth0 requires us to add an audience parameter to the authorized endpoint call while logging in to get a JOT access token instead of an opaque string. The value of the audience parameter should be the ID that was set for your API when that was created. So I will just go add that audience parameter to the authorized endpoint URL in the settings object and set it equal to projects-API. Now, if I go back to the app and log out and click login in the app, I end up on the auth0 interface, and I can log in with the same user account again. Note that now it prompts with a consent screen again, because adding the parameter to the authorized endpoint call means we're asking for a little different access than what was prompted for before. I actually have the setting to allow skipping user consent set for my API in the auth0 configuration, but auth0 only allows you to skip consent if the client requesting scopes is a verifiable first-party client application. And it turns out apps running on localhost do not meet that criteria. But it will only prompt for consent on first login with a given authorized endpoint call, and then it remembers for all future logins by that user for that application and that API. So I will accept that consent screen, and we get fully logged into our app again. If I look at local session now, you can see a much longer string. Now I'm being issued a JOT for the access token. I can copy that value, and go to jot.io again and paste it in, cleaning off the quotes and the property name. And you can see we have similar contents for the claims in the access token as we had with Identity Server. So as you can see, it's not totally a matter of just switching a couple URLs to use a different provider. But with a little documentation, it's just a matter of some changes to your client configuration, mostly in the form of getting the right parameters on the URLs that OIDC client will use to talk to the STS. Of course, again, if you know you are committed to just using that one provider, definitely feel free to just use their library instead of OIDC client. I just wanted to stick to OIDC client here in the demos to help you understand more about the protocols and see what things might be different and how to address those differences between providers. In this module, I showed you how to get your client app hooked up to auth3 as an identity provider instead of Identity Server. You saw that all the same concepts are there, but they manifest themselves a little different with a cloud-based identity provider instead of an STS framework like Identity Server. You saw that the first thing you'll have to decide is whether to use OIDC client or use a vendor-specific client library to connect to the STS. Again, for a real-world app, you might be better off using the vendor-specific library so you can follow their documentation and get support when needed. But I stuck to using OIDC client to emphasize the standardization and to reinforce the concepts about the protocol flows. I then showed how to configure a tenant at auth3 with a client application, API resource, and users so that we can use it for our Angular SPA app. I then made the simple changes needed to get our Angular app to start using auth3 as its STS instead of Identity Server. But then you saw there are a few things you need to do a little differently to get everything working. In this case, needing to override the URLs that are used by User Manager to add some required parameters for auth3 endpoints. So hopefully this helped to show you that identity providers that support OpenID Connect and OAuth2 properly will be very easy to integrate with once you understand the protocol flows. But the OpenID Connect spec is not too rigid, so small variations in URLs or parameters on those URLs are allowed. In the next module, I'll shift focus to authorization and access control, both at the STS and for accessing our APIs. So let's jump to the next module and dig in on the second phase of security, authorization.